case you didn't know, Germany's in a holding pattern, has been since September 24th, when citizens voted in a general election where the big center-right and center-left blocs underperformed badly. And when Germany's in a holding pattern, well, Europe's in a holding pattern. After setbacks with other suitors, a weary Angela Merkel left to bargain with Social Democrats who campaigned on the sworn promise that they would not play second fiddle once again to a Merkel who leaves coalition partners in tatters often. But Martin Schulz knows that playing hardball in this case could mean a snap election, an unprecedented gridlock which raises the specter of parliament newcomers from the far-right AfD faring even better second time around than they did in September, where they garnered 13% of the vote. They ran on an anti-immigrant ticket, and that raises the central question. Why is it that a nation that boasts near full employment, a budget surplus, robust growth, is finding it so hard to find a government? We'll be talking identity politics, how Germans see France's call for greater European integration, and how the pressure is coming from both sides of the political spectrum. What with the country's most powerful trade union, IG Metall, calling for big pay hikes and a 28-hour work week for many. Which direction now for Germany? Today in the France 24 debate, we're also asking, is this Angela Merkel's last chance? And with us from Hamburg, Josef Joffe, publisher and editor of weekly newspaper Die Zeit. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Here in the studio, Guillaume Duval, columnist for the magazine Economic Alternatives and the author of Made in Germany, The German Model Beyond Myths. Thank you for joining us. Also, welcome back Elisabeth Humbert-Dorfmüller, member of Germany's Social Democratic Party. And from Berlin, Jan Eichhorn, a researcher at the Depart think tank. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. 5 days of talks coming to an end. Could last till very late, says our correspondent. Talks characterized as tense. Despite grumblings from the Social Democrats over leaks, Angela Merkel starting the day confident that these exploratory discussions would finish on schedule this Thursday and graduate to more substantive bargaining. Kathy Clifford has more.
A last chance to find halfway ground. German Chancellor Angela Merkel arrives for what she expects to be a long, tough day.
We have done a lot of work in preparation, but there are still big obstacles to clear.
For the past 3 months, Merkel has been scrambling to find partners to govern with after inconclusive elections robbed her of her majority. When an attempt to forge a deal with two smaller parties failed, she turned to former partners, the SPD. They initially refused to form a government before agreeing to these talks, now her only hope for a coalition. The far right made record gains in September's election, seizing on anger over the influx of refugees ushered into the country by Merkel herself. She and her Conservative alliance are now toughening their stance on immigration to try to win back voters, a major sticking point with the centre-left SPD. The Conservatives are also pushing for tax cuts, while the SPD wants welfare gains. Their leader Martin Schulz struck a fairly optimistic tone, emphasising his party's #1 priority.
There are quite a number of issues we have identified together as common interests, but there are still big hurdles to clear. If we take part in such a government, it would be on the condition that this government makes Europe strong.
But even if a deal is struck, it could still be derailed by an SPD party vote. Those behind a resistance campaign believe governing alongside the Conservatives once again would be a death sentence after historic losses at the polls. Should a coalition deal fail, the possibility of a minority government under Merkel or new elections will be on the cards.
Well, Josef Joffe, the joke goes that in Germany the campaigning begins after the election. In this particular case, this could go on a long while, especially if, as you heard in that report, there's dissent between both major parties over the terms of the deal.
Well, normally it takes a few weeks, 6, 7 weeks, to hash out a coalition. This time we've seen it took a long time and without getting anywhere the last time round. What I would say here is that the conflict between those two parties, the center, I don't know, the centrist CDU and the center-left SPD, is not about principle but about the price. They're haggling about the price. How much tax hikes? How much social spending? How many refugees are we going to let into the country? How many more kindergartens are we going to build? How much are we going to increase defense spending? Do you see, as I run through the list, we're talking about how much and not whether or practice. So how much but not whether. So I think that they will come to an agreement, especially since they're used to each other. They have been in coalition the last 4 years, but there will be some problems, which we can talk about later, which have nothing to do how much you lower or raise taxes, which has to do with a weak leadership on both sides.
Weak leadership in both sides. How weak is the chancellor?
Well, she, if you want to trust the polls, a majority says they don't want her to sit out the term. She has lost, her personal loss here is enormous, and she has lost the touch of being an eternal winner who always manages by hook or by crook, by suasion or threat, to win the battle. So she has been seriously weakened. Now look at the other side. You have two people there vying for power. One is, we've heard him a little bit earlier, Martin Schulz, the chairman of the SPD. But remember, he brought in the worst electoral take of the SPD since the beginning of the Federal Republic in 1949. A more charismatic person is the current foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, but the party doesn't like him. So you have on both sides pretty seriously weakened players.
Elisabeth Humbert-Dorfmeister, do you agree that at the end of the day, weak leadership, but right now it's about bargaining, that they kind of know, they know what they want, they just have to agree on a number?
Well, yes, I would say that both have been weakened. The so-called grand coalition is not really a grand coalition anymore, because in 2013, both parties did a score of over 67%, I think. This time they did 53%, so just over majority. So it's not really a grand coalition anymore if it goes to a term. The party leaders will be able to agree on all points. I'm pretty sure of that, because Merkel wants to stay chancellor, and Schulz wants to stay chairman of the SPD, and of that I'm pretty sure. Tonight or tomorrow we will hear that they managed to agree. What I'm much less sure of is the party vote, the vote of the party members, which will take place end of January at the earliest, if I understand well. And I've spoken to many SPD party members. I'm one of them, and seriously, I don't see a majority in favor of a grand coalition coming out there. I just don't see it.
Even if it means then that going back to the polls?
Absolutely. Going back to the polls, or supporting on some issues a minority government with Chancellor Merkel until she fails over some point, and then it's up to the Christian Democrats to ask themselves if they should be a regeneration within their party. I mean, she has done 12 years successfully. Maybe it's time now for them to think about a change.
So you personally would vote against?
I will vote against grand coalition, absolutely.
And with the hopes of snap elections, or just let the CDU rule with a minority government?
The second you proposing. Let them try minority government, let them support on some issues. She might stay on for another year or two, maybe successfully, but in the end it will end with snap elections, of course.
Jan Eichhorn, your reaction to what Elisabeth Humbert-Dorfmüller just said?
Well, I think it's absolutely true. The dynamics within the Social Democrats are really important to look at this, and it's something that's playing on the mind. But we shouldn't forget also, for some of the people with Martin Schulz and some of the others, it might be their only chance to enter government. And politics is obviously always something where the dominant actors look in both directions. They look at what they can do themselves. And obviously, if you are in a leading position, you think that you can do good things, and looking into the party and the dynamics. So it's a really, really complicated thing here to predict in a sense as well. I also think it's not clear, on the other hand, what would happen if these talks don't come to a conclusion and an agreement, or if the Social Democrats rejected it. I don't think, if we look at Angela Merkel, she's always been a very, very pragmatic politician who would have clear positions, but would also be quite happy to move those positions if facts mandated that she did. So if everything failed, I don't think it's automatically another election. I think there would be a very, very careful consideration, actually, about minority government. It's ruled out at the moment, pretty much in most states. But I think one would look at it quite carefully. They don't like it, clearly, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion necessarily at this point.
So if the Grand Coalition fails, you also sounds like you're saying that Angela Merkel could hang around.
Yes.
Well, it's. I think there's a very high likelihood that she will not be the chancellor for the next 4 years. But I do think there actually is, to some extent, the potential that there might be an agreement for a kind of interim period. I mean, the Christian Democrats are not ready to replace her right now. I think that's one of the key problems. So I do think very pragmatically in this situation, there is a scenario in which they would be looking at a gradual transition, actually. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the degree of pragmatism that Angela Merkel usually applies in situations like this. That could change quite drastically from previous positions. So I think there are kind of multiple scenarios that are plausible.
Guillaume Duval, statistics out this Thursday. Growth in Germany in 2017, 2.2%, much higher than what was predicted at the start of the year. Unemployment near record lows. A budget surplus of 1.2%. We haven't had a budget surplus in this country since I was a little boy. So that's a long time ago. Why is it that she can't form a coalition? What's going on?
It's very surprising from a French perspective what is going on in Germany. We are absolutely not used to this kind of situation. But it's always when you have growth and a surplus to dispatch that you have this kind of problem.
Rising expectations?
Yes. The German people have had a very hard time at the beginning of the years 2000 with the Schröder reforms and so on. And now people are expecting better times, and therefore the SPD cannot go in a coalition if they don't have a very high level of tax for the rich, of social expenses and so on. The other thing is important for French, from the French perspective, is the European issues.
Yeah, because in the report it sounds like that's the big, and you heard Martin Schulz say, that's
yes.
the big sticking point, Europe.
Yes, the problem is Schulz is very emphasizing this point, and that's very positive for the future. But the question from a French perspective is, are both leaders not so much weakened that if they have an agreement at that point, can they do what they want in that regard?
Or could it be, Guillaume Duval, that it's not all about economics? Could it be that it's also to do with identity and with the whole migrant issue that's looms large?
But the European issue is also an identity issue for German people. I think each German chancellor, no German chancellor wants to be the cause of an explosion of Europe, and that's a very important issue for the German population also. And therefore, if Merkel and Schulz have an agreement on that point and can boost the European integration process that could be very positive for German and the European also.
Josef Joffe, we saw attempts to form a coalition with the Liberals, the FDP, blow up. A lot of it had to do with Europe, the FDP wanting a more German Europe, if you will, and Martin Schulz sounding like he wants more of a European Germany. Which way is Angela Merkel going to go in the end?
Well, just one footnote, I'm not so sure that the failure of the first attempt to form a larger coalition had to do with anti-Europeanism on the part of Lindner, the head of the FDP. It had to do more with markets and tax cuts and freer markets, etc. But that said, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in Germany about Europe, in the sense that it is something that you pray to on the altar of European integration. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty, I'm not sure the Germans are more willing than any other nation in Europe to give up sovereignty while they are praying on the altar of Europe. Especially, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that there isn't much love. Europe is not a love affair. It's a practical issue, and practical issues raise the question, how much is going to pay us? How much do we have to pay? And that's where a core issue between Germany and France is. As we know, France wants more money from Europe. It wants less fiscal discipline. And of course, the Germans want the opposite. So,
and the Germans want the opposite. We're going to pick up on that point, Josef Joffe, because we have to take a very quick break. When we come back,
okay.
And we'll stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Yeah.
The Observers, presented by Derek Thompson.
Take a new look at the news. Eyewitness accounts from those at the heart of the action, all over the world. Exclusive videos you've never seen before, all verified by our journalists.
The Observers on France 24 and France24.com. Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
In 1976, 10 years after seizing power in the Central African Republic, President Bokassa proclaimed himself emperor. 14 years of bloodthirsty dictatorship later, France put an end to his reign. But the country has struggled ever since to establish good governance. In the face of interreligious massacres and a choice between exile or a ruined economy, some have begun to regret the passing of Bokassa's regime.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
You're watching France 24, I'm Mark Owen. These are the headlines. Tunisia on the edge. There's been 3 nights of clashes. Protesters angry over price and tax rises. And they've been confronted by police using tear gas. These images telling the story in many ways. Over 500 arrests. It's all set to continue. The man who blew the whistle on sweetheart deals on tax in Luxembourg could have his sentence quashed. The court has ruled he should have had protected status over the documents he leaked to expose the scandal. France, Britain, Germany and the EU's top diplomat all urging Donald Trump to think again on pulling out of the Iran nuclear treaty. The US president has consistently called it, quote, the worst deal ever, unquote, and he's on the verge of reinforcing sanctions. No decision, though, expected on Thursday. We await what happens later today, Friday. Racist and anti-Semitic pamphlets are to be shelved. Gallimard has gone back on its plan to print-run writings of Louis Ferdinand Céline after an outcry. Nazi hunters threatened to sue if publication went ahead. Those are the main stories. Some more stay with us throughout the night. You're watching France 24.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and Germany's holding its breath to a lesser degree, the rest of Europe as well. That's because we're on the final day of exploratory talks to form another grand coalition between Angela Merkel's CDU and the center-left SPD party, both parties which underperformed badly in last September's general election. With us to talk about it, the publisher and editor of a weekly newspaper, Die Zeit, Joseph Joffe, is with us from Hamburg. In the studio, Guillaume Duval, columnist with economic alternatives, Alternative Economique, as I said, and the author of Made in Germany, The German Model Beyond the Myths. With us as well, Elisabeth Humbert-Dorfmüller, member of Germany's Social Democratic Party, and from Berlin, Jan Eichhorn, who is with the think tank Depart. Welcome back to all of you. This talk of another GroKo, as the Germans call it, a grand coalition. By the way, it's not two parties, it's three parties. We often forget that there is the CDU's sister party, the Bavarian-based CSU. Now, last week, we saw the president of that party showing off his conservative credentials, Horst Seehofer welcoming Hungary's Viktor Orban. The leader of Hungary refuses migrant quotas and who the EU denounces as illiberal in his policies. For his part, Seehofer sees no problem.
Viktor Orban was a courageous resistance fighter under the communist dictatorship. He has repeatedly and brilliantly won the trust of his people in democratic elections. And he is very successful in the positive development of Hungary. There is no doubt that he stands on constitutional ground.
Elisabeth Humbert-Dorfmüller, what do you make of those remarks and of that visit?
Well, we know CSU, SPD has been twice already in the past in the grand coalition with CDU and CSU. At the beginning, we thought these differences with CSU, which is standing on the right of CDU, are not possible to overcome, but they overcame it. I mean, there are differences on many issues. The migration issues is probably the most prominent one. CSU is very harsh on closing down the borders also for the futures, or restraining it quite severely. SPD, on the other hand, wants to open the possibility for the families of some of the refugees who came alone to Germany to join them. So this is a very important breaking point of the coalition talks. There are, of course, points in favor and not in favor of letting the families come over. But I would just say one which is in favor, which is that these migrants who came are predominantly men. And if some of them, at least a part of them, are able to bring their families to Germany, it will be better for Germany to have a more balanced, let's say, a population of migrants, to have also women and children. So this is the reason why SPD is open on that question. Of course, the number has to be quite limited, but there has to be the possibility of bringing over parts of the families of these people. So this is certainly a point where these two parties are going to squabble.
Jan Eichhorn, when we were talking in part one of our discussion about who could blow up coalition talks, did we overlook the CSU?
Well, I think you're pointing to a really crucial point about the CSU. Was also on the Europe issue we talked about earlier. They genuinely, they are the ones who have the biggest difference. I mean, Martin Schulz and Angela Merkel both easily imagine deeper European integration, if it is, for Merkel in particular, the German stability mechanism. So I think it's the CSU that has been skeptical, although they would be willing to.
We're sorry to interrupt you. We're losing the connection, Jan Eichhorn. We seem to be having sound problems there with Berlin. We're going to try to call you back and fix those straight away. Guillaume Duval, your reaction?
Yes, the CSU issue is a very important one because the CSU is very afraid from the progression of AfD in Bavaria, and the CSU have a big election in the next autumn to overcome, and will probably lose a lot of voters then. They will be very, very hard in the discussion, in the coalition discussion on the migrant issue, but also on the European issue, and that can be a problem. Till now, the CSU, at the end of the day, have always said yes to the CDU, but there is a very big internal crisis also inside of the CSU, actually, and nobody knows.
You were mentioning in part one, by the way, how you split up, and this is one of the big coalition questions, that growth dividends that the Germans are getting. Note that Germany's biggest trade union this week has staged a walkout. The metalworkers at IG Metall demanding a 6% pay increase going into collective bargaining, and the demand that workers gain the right to reduce their weekly hours from 35 to 28 hours. 28 hours a week working to care for children or elderly or sick relatives.
The economy is doing well, really well, for a long time. Companies are making profits and employees would like to have their share.
Josef Joffe, the chances of 6% pay hikes.
Yes. What are the chances?
Yes.
Well, you know, when unions go into a collective bargaining, they tend to reach for the moon, and they'll be, they'll usually accept half the moon. And I think that 28 working week of 28 is just absurd, especially since we've been telling the French all these years you have to get off your 35-hour week. But I think the way German unions operate is, open your big mouth, but in the end, come to quite a pragmatic conclusion.
Same with politics?
Pardon me?
Same as in politics?
Pardon me?
The same.
Yes, I mean, yes, I think that's what's going to happen to the coalition talks. As I keep emphasizing, it's not about principles, but about pricing. And so we're just haggling about the price. There's probably only one issue of principle. The SPD wants to do away with the current two-level health insurance scheme that we have in Germany, with 20% of the people or so have private insurance and the rest has social insurance, and they want to get rid of the private insurance, I think, and to have one national health scheme. I think that's where the CDU-CSU is not going to budge. But I assume that the SPD knows that.
Guillaume Duval, this obsession that's lasted for decades about inflation, and we were talking in part one of our discussion about an export-driven economy that needs at some point perhaps to evolve or change a little bit. Is that in the cards at all?
That's not very much in the German discussion actually, but with the wage hikes, with the expense discussion, it's quite there. Germany has to change its economic policy for his own good. The infrastructure in Germany is in a bad shape. The poverty is quite high, and so on. The poverty by the older people, for example, that have to change. That has we have had a beginning from this change with a minimum wage and so on, but that have to go on. That's the difficulty at the moment with this discussion, but the SPD must have a lot of things in that area to accept the Grand Coalition, to have a lot of agreement from the CDU about social expenses in particular.
Jan Eichhorn, there was one columnist in one of the French newspapers this Thursday who was talking about how the French have a complex when it comes to the Germans, But you just heard Guillaume Duval mention infrastructure issues, things like rail service that doesn't always run on time. This demand of a 28-hour work week for some by the metalworkers union. Is Germany really the giant that it claims to be?
Well, just look at the numbers.
Well, there's one thing about objective figures, and the second is about lived reality and perceptions. I mean, you have to also see that for a lot of people in Germany, they don't feel necessary. They feel actually that Germany is in a good economic position, but they're really skeptical about what's going to happen in the future. So while Germans on the one hand say in lots of polls that, we're in a good position, but when you ask them, how do you feel about the future? What's going to happen? There's skepticism. And part of this has to do with, in particular, certain industries. While overall GDP has been developing quite positively, certain aspects around real wages haven't developed for all parts of the population. So Germans are quite cautious in a sense. And that's always been the case in economic attitudes. German people have a very cautious approach to things, are not as enthusiastic about a quick boom as you might find also in Anglo-Saxon countries, for example. So I think that swings along with this, that actually there's a very cautious attitude amongst the German population.
A cautious attitude, Elisabeth Umverdorf, yet we saw the far right enter parliament. We've seen that politics have become more polarized.
They have become more polarized, but they have become more polarized all over Europe. I think there is a kind of normalization going on there. The fact that you didn't have any extreme right party in the German parliament for 60 years was, of course, linked to Germany's history. But I think we have European countries are starting to resemble each other on some issues, on economic, on political issues. And this anti-Islamic movement, of course, also managed to implant itself in Germany, reinforced by the migration crisis of 2015. But I think even without this migration crisis, this party would have entered the parliament. So personally, I don't think in a new election, in a snap election, AfD would score better than their 13% right now. I think they are, for the moment, at their maximum level. Of course, if things, whatever, get worse or people feel unhappy about the economic condition or whatever, then the numbers could change. But for the moment, I think they are at their maximum. I want to believe that.
You want to believe that? France's president, who ran against a far-right candidate in the second round of the presidential elections, he's saying, of course, that Europe, a more integrated Europe, is the answer. And Emmanuel Macron making that call this week from as far away as China. On a state visit there, the French president was asked whether China's growing stakes in strategic sectors of certain EU countries was driving a wedge between member states.
I hope that we can build a Europe of ambition. Today, Europe isn't coherent on this subject. It's not China's fault, it's our fault. And so you're right, there are countries that are much more open to Chinese interests because they prefer to play on short-term bilateral interests, sometimes at the expense of European interests.
Joseph Joffe, your thoughts on that and the Europe that Macron wants?
Well, look, we always try to be good Europeans, and we're always pushing a more closer union, and we always invoke the civil religion of Europe. But underneath there is of course a power struggle going on between the key countries, especially between Germany and France. And the power struggle is not over persons, but it's over how to run and who runs this union. And the old conflicts that have divided the Germans from the French have been about who gets his hand on Germany's resources. Who will Germany pay to support the euro, even though the southern tier is not as reform-minded as it has been? And so that's why somebody like Herr Schäuble, the finance minister, is not too happy about a finance minister, European. And if there should be one, we'll make sure he gets a very small budget. This has been a classic struggle between Paris and Bonn and Berlin, and it will continue. But they too will have to hash it out. But right now, I don't think that the Germans, as weak as the government is, as we have described, will submit to French leadership. Because the power relationships are still quite skewed, given that Germany is the number one economy in Europe, it's the fourth economy in the world. So dreams of a tandem or the couple, both leading Europe, will fail because they want to lead Europe in the opposite direction, in opposite directions. That said, I think they can certainly agree on maintaining a European voice on trade and economic issues, certainly vis-a-vis China. That's one area where interests mesh. As to a European Federation, United States of Europe, not in our lifetime.
Not in our lifetime. Guillaume Duval, what kind of relationship does Emmanuel Macron really want with Germany?
The issue of couple between Germany and France, and it's wrong. I agree with Joseph Joffe on that point. It's wrong also because there are other countries in Europe, and that's make the things complicated if we present that way. But a bargaining between France and Germany is necessary, and the power balance is not what Joseph Joffe has said. Is much better for France than many Germans think, and many French also, because the Brexit has changed the situation.
In favor of France or in favor of Germany?
In favor of France, because Germany has no another player to play with against France, and integration request from France. And the outside situation, the geopolitical situation, has also changed the power balance with regard with defense policy, external policy for Europe, and so on. Germany is still a very small country in that kind of issue, and European defense can only be built with France and so on. So I think if Macron is serious with what he wants for Europe, he can get it from Germany also, because no German leader will want to be responsible for the explosion of Europe and so on. At the end of the day, if Macron do what he wants, he can get the agreement of the German leadership.
Elisabeth Hammer-Dorfmann, you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree with that part. I think that he is right now in a position of power. He has done an offensive move by suggesting things that in Germany maybe would not be a consensus, but Germany has to respond to it. I definitely think that France has managed to be up to speed. Of course, we know about the German economic power, but the German economic power and the export miracle of Germany has been made possible through the euro. The German export miracle has started from the right beginning of the introduction of the euro. So Germany has a lot. German's power is based very much on Europe and the euro.
And Jan Eichhorn, what a lot of French are saying is, well, now it's time for Germany to pay up, most notably by upping its defense spending. And what we saw Angela Merkel, who has gone to the African continent, who's front and center when it came to that EU-Africa summit, but also in development aid, so that there isn't this huge influx of people having to flee their countries.
Who are you asking?
And this is one of the points where it becomes, obviously, again, a difficult bargaining with the Social Democrats, because whatever she does at this point, she has to be able to get the Social Democrats on board, obviously, and getting this decision going right now. However, within Germany, obviously, if you can package things as being part of the migration policy, refugee policy, that works to some extent. And Germany is willing to put money into that to some extent. If it goes into the broader scope of things, it becomes much, much more difficult to sell that within Germany, of course.
So, final word, Jan, on Angela Merkel. What will be? We said in part one of our discussion that she will probably be able to cobble together a coalition, but is she damaged goods?
I think she's definitely been very negatively affected by this. I find it very difficult to imagine that Angela Merkel will see out this term.
Josef Joffe?
She is damaged goods, but I'm very cautious with her. We've seen her in a tight spot many times, and she has managed to get out of them by waiting things out, by maneuvering, by balancing. So, but look, somebody who is going to her fourth term is bound to be damaged good. The problem with her is that the nation is bored with her, as it was bored with Helmut Kohl, who did manage 16 years. So, but one last point, in American politics, there's a saying that says you can't beat somebody with nobody. And in her party at this point, there's no somebody strong enough to unseat her. And that's why, if I have to bet, I'll give her better odds than the other two in our group here.
All right,
Josef Joffe. Hold out to the yeah.
Josef Joffe, I want to thank you for joining us from Hamburg. I want to thank as well Jan Eichhorn in Berlin, Elizabeth Humbert-Dorfmüller, and Guillaume Duval. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
All right.
We say hello to James Creedon. By the way, our Berlin correspondent telling us there was pretty much a media blackout when it comes to, as promised, for those 5 days of talks, a few leaks here and there. One issue here that's creating a media storm is one that we've been talking about, which is the migrant crisis and the new French president's response to it.
That's right. It is getting a lot of headlines here in France. I suppose there is a connection, this issue being a particularly difficult one for leaders in France and Germany to sort of navigate. And Macron has clearly taken a very hardline approach that is alienating a lot of people in his own party who would have migrated perhaps over from the political left, some of them. So it's a very touchy one for him. And you can see that efforts have been made now to appease aid groups and aid associations that are almost universally critical of this, Secours Catholique, a Catholic charity, as well as Médecins du Monde and others. So you can see this headline on our own website. Aid groups slam Macron's asylum law reform. This is the Daily Star from Lebanon. They're also pointing out the fact that he's under fire from this. The Economist saying that a lot of the MPs in his party are first-time MPs, and that an issue like this could really be extremely divisive and potentially shatter kind of the support base. But we'll get to a couple of elements later that show that maybe he's not too much in danger of that. Now, Le Nouvel Observateur...
Yeah, this is the cover everyone's been talking about here.
That's right. So one of the kind of more left-leaning, usually very adulatory magazines when it comes to Emmanuel Macron. And here you have barbed wire, and I'm not sure if it's visible on the bottom of the screen there, but welcome to the country of human rights. So that has generated a huge amount of response today on social media, Francois.
Some say that this is in poor taste. Do you think it's in poor taste, this cover?
In protest?
Poor taste.
Poor taste.
Oh, poor taste. No, they're free to express themselves, so no, not at all.
Right, well, a lot of people have an opinion on it of one kind or another, and just to show you what some are saying, Frédéric Martel, I can barely defend this front cover, which is indigne, just despicable, really, for a French newspaper. It is completely idiotic, and he goes on to say that they need new management. Others saying that they're stuck back in the era of 1968, and that it's disinformation, it's propaganda, and it's demonstrating a will to defend everything that's going to destroy our country, right? So that's pretty strong language. Another person here saying, is this front cover a demonstration that we've reached a tipping point in Emmanuel Macron's presidency early on vis-a-vis the support? Now, why do they say that? Well, the Nouvel Observateur has been extremely positive, usually in its tone, certainly on its front covers, for Emmanuel Macron. You can see here just a selection of one or two that I picked out. The boss and the man of the situation. So
the man of the hour.
There you go. So you've had lots of comments like that. Now, one person who did write his opinion for Le Nouvel Observateur is the very well-respected Nobel Literature laureate J.M. Leclisio, who he grew up in French overseas territories, seems to relate to the difficulty of refugees and migrants, spoke about his dismay at a lack of humanitarian sort of values in the approach to this, and called it simply despicable. There is no other word for this whole idea of sorting through different migrant cases in the camps. So that's one. Actually, Emmanuel Macron seems to have responded more or less to criticisms like that today from Rome. Now, one other person who chimed in is the presidential candidate for the now very much weakened Socialist Party, Benoît Hamon. He used the term fake news for a government that says that it has humanity at the heart of its policy. And he says that this is akin to criminalizing poverty, in particular the organisation of or sorting through the different cases of migrants, and he says it's a dishonour for the Republic. So this is a very divisive one. I'll finish with one piece of information that came from a French talk show, C'est dans l'air, and they've been tweeting today about their discussion about this particular issue, which is really one of the central issues in the French media today. And according to studies, apparently 6 out of 10 French people are seeking more firmness and fermeture, indeed closing of borders when it comes to this migrant issue. So it looks like Macron might be playing to the choir in some regards in this respect, that there may be quite a degree of public support.
That bill to tighten asylum rules is just starting to make its way into the high halls of government. So this is a controversy that's not going away. Many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.